Welcome everybody to tonight's production of The Dictionary as Data with Peter Sokolowski. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I am the Curator of Programming at Planet Word. I am delighted to welcome you all this evening. If you are a member of Planet Word, you've probably heard me give this little thank you before, but the thanks are genuine. Your support is really important. It enables us to keep the museum free. It enables us to bring in guests. It enables us to do things like host a school Scrabble tournament, which is where I first heard a version of this talk that Peter's going to give tonight. And if you found out about this from another way and you want to be in Planet Word's orbit, the best way to do that is to sign up for our newsletter, planetwordmuseum.org, or follow us on social media. And that's it for the business. Our guest tonight is Peter Sokolowski. He's an editor-at-large for Merriam-Webster and a friend to Planet Word, has been on the word panel for the spelling bee that met here. And as I mentioned, gave a talk to the rather anxious parents who were sitting around in our auditorium waiting for their kids to compete in our school Scrabble tournament. And I heard this talk then and knew that the Planet Word folks were exactly the right audience to geek out on dictionaries and their history. So Peter, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and it's a treat to be here. I'm going to share my screen so that we can see some slides. And yes, Planet Word, thank you so much. Planet Word is such a treasure. It's such a wonderful spot, a wonderful place. It was a perfect place to share with the spellers recently at the National Spelling Bee, and I know many of them came over to visit. It was also the perfect place to have the word panel meeting. That's an interesting experience. It was my first time being part of the group that chooses the words that we later encounter during the National Spelling Bee, sets them in an order that makes sense, an order of difficulty that makes sense, chooses the sentences, and often my role was often sort of tinker with the definitions to make them short and sweet, but still appropriate, still in the Merriam-Webster voice, as it were. And so that was a thrilling kind of experience. Yes, we did it right there. So we're going to talk a little bit about dictionaries, about how people use them, but also about how they're written and how they're sold. We're going to kind of hit a lot of different topics tonight. And I begin with this slide, by the way, is the architect's rendering of the sculpture of a life-size dictionary above the entrance at Merriam-Webster headquarters, the building in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's a copy of Webster's second unabridged dictionary that's above the door. So if you ever come to Springfield, you can come see that. But what we're going to begin with is a basic question, a question that I think is one that maybe most of us take for granted and think has an obvious answer. And what we've learned over the years is that there's always something to learn from this question, which is basically, what makes a person look up a word? And we're going to investigate that in some depth. The fact is, for 400 years of English language monolingual lexicography, the first dictionary of English appeared in about 1603. But even then, it was not a dictionary as we know them today. So that means Shakespeare had no dictionary, something, again, that maybe we don't think about too often. But we do have, so for 400 years of lexicography, there has been very little known about how dictionary users actually use the dictionary, which words they look up and when they look them up. So dictionary publishers have not had that information or that intelligence. And now we do. But we do have a few anecdotes about, through the years, how dictionaries were used. There's one great story about Samuel Johnson. He's the man in this wonderful portrait by Joshua Reynolds. Samuel Johnson, who wrote the great dictionary in London in 1755. Many people call the first modern dictionary of English very much a landmark in lexicography and the model for Noah Webster. But when he published his dictionary, he was congratulated by a matron of London society who told him that she was so pleased that he had omitted the naughty words. To which Dr. Johnson is supposed to have replied, "Madam, I find that you have been looking them up," which of course is the only way that one would know that a word was not in the dictionary, which is by looking for it in the first place. So this is kind of negative evidence of a word, but it gives us a good clue about how dictionaries are used. And we all do know that the dirty words, the naughty words are among the words that people do look up in the dictionary. There's another anecdote during the making of the other, another of the great English language dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary. This is a photograph of James Murray, the first editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, picture from around 1900. And the Oxford faculty at the university served as consultants for the dictionary project. And a new word was submitted, and he sent it off. It was a medical term. He sent it to the Oxford medical faculty with the simple question, should this word be added to the new English dictionary? And the answer came back, absolutely not. This word is too obscure, it's too abstruse, it is used by specialists, it is not going to be encountered by the public. Now, by the way, I think this gives us a little insight into maybe a little prejudice about what a dictionary is and what it isn't by those medical professors at that time. They probably thought dictionaries were more literary or belletristic in use. Dictionaries were originally made to read the Bible and literature, and they probably didn't include the technical vocabulary, the professional vocabulary of their own specialization in that. And now we know, of course, that the specialized vocabulary is a big part of what we expect to find in a dictionary. But at any rate, the word was not added to the dictionary. And in 1901, maybe the biggest story of the new 20th century took place. The Queen died, Queen Victoria. And so her son would become king, and there was a coronation scheduled. But before the coronation, the new king became ill. In fact, he became seriously ill. In fact, he became mortally ill, and the coronation was postponed. So now you have a whole country with an intense curiosity about the condition of this new king. Will he survive? What is the treatment? How can we, expect to learn more about this new king and his medical crisis? And unfortunately, the word that named the condition of the king was the word that was dropped by the editor at the recommendation of the Oxford medical faculty. And so again, we have evidence of curiosity in a specific word by the public, and that the word was not in the dictionary to satisfy that curiosity. And by the way, the word was appendicitis. Now, in 1996, Merriam-Webster put our dictionary online for free on the internet. In 1996 is going back to the early days of the internet. There was no real business model. There weren't ads, for example. This is before eBay, before Amazon, before Google. And the idea initially was to put a fully featured dictionary online and to see if people would use it. It wasn't certain that the internet would be functioning in exactly the way that we understand it today. And a little bit of background on the Webster tradition and Merriam-Webster's dictionary in particular. Webster, here, Noah Webster, was born in 1758. Here in this image, he looks like money, and that's sort of appropriate because he was personal friends with Benjamin Franklin and with George Washington. He was very politically active as a Federalist around the time of the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution. The historian Jill Lepore calls him not a founding father quite, but maybe a founding uncle, which is kind of a neat phrase. But born in 1758 means that he turned 18 in 1776. And what you're passionate about when you're 18 is likely something that will drive many of the interests of your life. And that was true for Webster. He wrote a dictionary, maybe the first American dictionary in 1806. And he, of course, wrote textbooks for spelling as well. But the big dictionary that he produced, his magnum opus, the one that we remember best, was from 1828. Now, in 1828, Webster, who was a great scholar and lexicographer, he was not such a great businessman. But dictionaries were hard to sell. Books were still rare and expensive. And at that time, 1828, his dictionary cost $20. $20 in 1828 could buy you this grandfather clock. So it was not a household item the way we know dictionaries today. Webster's dictionary was a luxury item. Now, after Webster's death, the printers in Springfield, Massachusetts, George and Charles Merriam, took over the publishing of the dictionary and the sale of the dictionary. And they had a different strategy to sell the book. And you can see at the top of this advertisement from 1847, $6. So they reduced the price radically. And frankly, this is the reason I have a job. Making this kind of decision, in a way, it's kind of the great American business story, which is to say, to make money through volume of sales and to reduce the price as much as possible. And so their idea was to make a dictionary much more affordable by printing many, many copies of it and selling as many as they could. And in some ways, this is the strategy that takes us all the way through to the internet. I'll explain why. Because after the big unabridged dictionary of 1847 for $6, the Merriams introduced an abridgment of that book. And this is a very famous abridgment. This is one that perhaps you have at home, called Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. In 1898, the first collegiate dictionary, that's the one that we have in this photograph here, the first edition, it cost $3. An even smaller version of the book came out in 1947, the first mass market paperback dictionary. And again, this was really as much a business innovation as it was a scholarly one. This made the dictionary available to everyone. And in some ways in 1947, this was also the inheritor of a special edition made for GIs during the war. World War II saw the mass production of small paperback books. They were literally designed to fit in the pockets of the uniforms of the United States Army soldiers. Merriam-Webster produced a small dictionary for this purpose, and it was one of the most coveted items of those free books that were published for the armed services, the armed services edition. And in many ways, there have been soldiers who came back who said that they used those dictionaries, not just for letters home, but to educate themselves, to read books in the trenches, and then to go on to education after the war. But this paperback in 1947 sold for 35 cents. And in fact, on sale, it was 25 cents. Now, this is truly mass market sales. And it has to be said that after 25 cents, there's really only one place you can go for wide distribution of a dictionary, and that is to make your dictionary free. And that is exactly what the company did. In 1996, this is the first homepage of Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. Some of you may remember this. There was an online bookstore you see there, and in fact, print sales increased for a couple of years after this website went up. And you might remember too, some of us remember that everything in those days was www this and www that. And so we have Webster, which was what one of the ideas that perhaps people thought would catch on. It didn't. But you can also see the features. One of the features, Word of the Day, which is still going strong with nearly 1 million subscribers as an email and a podcast. Word of the Day, one of the great online features of the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So this dictionary went up in 1996, and for the first time, the publishers, Merriam-Webster, we could see which words people were looking up. And what we saw initially was a kind of a static list, a list that looked a little bit like a vocabulary list, like the kind of list you would study for an SAT exam. But then something happened that changed the way that we view the online dictionary, and changed it quite dramatically, because we were learning as we go. In 1997, maybe the first big story that was broadly shared online was the death of Princess Diana. And what we saw was that the words people looked up at that moment suddenly changed. And we could see almost by the minute the curiosity of the public watching them look words up in the dictionary. And the words that were looked up in the dictionary tell part of the story of Princess Diana's death. The word paparazzi was her cause of death. We had the word cortege that spiked during her funeral, and the word princess itself, which gave us a clue for a very important motivation and a very significant number of the words that people look up in the dictionaries. That is to say, words that are themselves not very difficult vocabulary terms. So let's take a look at these 3 words. I always say that we're good at reading data, we're not good at reading minds, but I think we can all agree that the word paparazzi is a hard word to spell. I think in every newsroom in the country, people were saying, are there 2 P's? Are there 2 Z's? What's the singular? Are there 2 R's? So this is a word that everyone is looking up online. The word cortege is one of those modern French borrowings that is pronounced like a French word. In other words, its phonetics don't correspond to English orthography. Now, that needless to say, that's true for a large portion of the English language. This is why we have spelling bees in English, and they don't in languages like Italian and French and Spanish, because those languages are much more normalized phonetically, and they're spelled the way they sound in general, at least. Now, finally, the word princess. Now, here we have a word that's not terribly difficult to spell. It's a word that would be very familiar to most adults, English-speaking adults, certainly. But here we have, I think, an example of a word that was not looked up for lexical reasons, but a word that was looked up for encyclopedic reasons. Now, the distinction I'm drawing there is that a lexical reason would be the spelling of the word, the meaning of the word, and the phonetics of the word. But within a dictionary definition, very often there are what we might call encyclopedic elements. For example, questions you might ask, is someone born a princess? Is a princess higher than a duchess? Does a princess automatically become a queen? What becomes of a princess after a divorce from a prince? I mean, there's all kinds of questions, many of which can be answered by a good dictionary definition that will have some of that information in it. And so it's my suspicion that princess is among the kinds of words that we will see more of in this talk, words that aren't lexically difficult, but are difficult in some kind of cultural, encyclopedic, informational, historical way. 9/11, needless to say, was an event that stopped the world, and like COVID recently, became an event that sent people to the dictionary in order to better understand what they had just experienced. And you see words like rubble and triage initially, words of concrete destruction. And they're followed by words of politics and analysis, words like terrorism and jingoism. And finally, during that week following 9/11 and for the weeks after, you see words of the sort of personal reactions, succumb and surreal. And the word surreal ended up being the top word, the most looked up word in the dictionary in the days and weeks after 9/11. And this makes me as a dictionary guy, as a card carrying lexicographer, hope that it's a good definition. I mean, that it's a helpful definition, that the definition of surreal isn't, for example, of or relating to surrealism, which is one of those unhelpful definitions. Well, it turns out that this is a great definition. The definition of surreal is marked by the intense irrational reality of a dream. Marked by the intense irrational reality of a dream. It wasn't written for 9/11, but it seems like it could have been a day that was incredibly intense, that was irrational in many ways, but that was also all too real. But the word I would draw your attention to in this definition is the word dream, because this is just one of those subtle things that's part of a good dictionary definition, something we all maybe take for granted. But in this case, we have a word like surreal that is derived from the word surrealism. Surrealism, the artistic movement of the early 20th century, that itself had at its origins the studies and conclusions of Sigmund Freud, his ideas about the life of the unconscious, and that sometimes the images that we see in a painting by Dali or by Magritte, these were literally the dream life. They were paintings of the unconscious, artistic inspiration, and also of dreams in a sense. And so this is a definition that harks back to the word's roots, to its own source. And I think that is a nice and elegant definition. Now, surreal, by the way, is a word that we've encountered many times since. It's a word that we've learned a lot about. For example, I don't think this word was triggered by its use in the newspaper headlines, for example. I don't think this was a word that was used in a speech by the president. I think this was a word that was spontaneously looked up by so many people that it caused a spike in our data. It turns out that the word surreal is the word that Americans turn to in moments of enormous shock, surprise, and tragedy. This is the word that was looked up after the Boston Marathon bombings. It was the word that was looked up most after the Newtown shootings. It was the word that was most looked up after Robin Williams' suicide. This is the word that Americans spontaneously turn to in moments like that. And it's a sort of a discovery and a sad revelation, but a fascinating one to see in the pages or the online pages of the dictionary, the sort of traces of our thoughts. Now, Michael Jackson's death was another major event, and these words kind of tell a story all of themselves. The word stricken and resuscitate, RIP, standing for rest in peace, or requiescat in pace. Condolences. The word icon was used in almost every obituary. And here the word emaciated, which became the most looked up word of that week and that month and the entire summer of 2009. Indeed, it was the second most looked up word of the year in 2009. Emaciated, the reported condition of his body. And once again, a word that many adults would be familiar with. And I think here we have something like a problem with context, a word that people might associate with, for example, starvation in the developing world, but not with the most famous pop star in the world. And so this sort of discordant juncture of the word and the subject sent people to the dictionary. And also there's something else about this word that we find very frequently. It has classical roots. This is a word with Greek or Latin roots. And again, most of those words tend to be technical, medical, legal, or very abstract. Those tend to be the words that people look up the most. Now, obviously, politics triggers an enormous amount of interest. People who follow politics closely are reading a lot online, and then they go to the dictionary online. There are a lot of different moments in the past 20 years that we can trace this way. One was in 2015 when Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy. It would have been unthinkable even 10 years before that, and certainly in most of our lifetimes, for a serious presidential candidate in the United States to refer to themselves as a socialist. And that's a big change since the Cold War, needless to say, and it was a word that spiked after Bernie Sanders announced his candidacy. In the early days of the Trump administration, we saw the term alternative fact being used by Kellyanne Conway, and this sent so many people to the dictionary to check up the word fact. And now this is truly remarkable because fact is a very basic word in English, and it's not very difficult to spell. However, this also shows another kind of behavior for the dictionary. One thing that we use in the household, or maybe, with our teachers or our spouses, with our children, we use the dictionary to correct someone else. And in this case, the public was looking up the word to correct a public figure, to check the definition. And this also showed a way that social media has evolved. This was one of the early examples of what people call a kind of snarky tone to the Twitter feed at Merriam-Webster, because all that was tweeted here is the definition itself and the simple fact that the word was triggered by this statement by Kellyanne Conway. Now, people, took this as either a comic or political act. But what I found is that implicitly, when we have tens of thousands of lookups in the space of a short amount of time in the dictionary, implicitly the country is asking a question. They're asking us a question. They're asking a question about a word. It may be about the etymology or the definition or the spelling of a word, but the word is in the public sphere. The word is in the public national conversation. And the dictionary, if it's being asked a question, can give an answer. And I think what's interesting about social media, in particular Twitter for the dictionary, is that unlike other big brands, unlike, say, Levi's or Toyota or Budweiser, Merriam-Webster can actually provide its knowledge, can provide its product on Twitter for free. And this has kind of changed everything in the way that we understand how the dictionary functions. In other words, it's not just the people looking up the dictionary that give us data that we can then refer back to our own work and defining, but it's also something we can report back to the public in a circular kind of way. We can say the public are interested in this word, and we can give you information about it. Now, we've talked about specific words, newsy words, words that were triggered by tragedy. And it's also true that English is just simply difficult. And many people use the dictionary for reasons that have nothing to do with current events, but because of the difficulties of the English language. Among the top most looked up words in the dictionary are these two confusing words, affect and effect, because they're often confused in writing, and they're just one of those terrible difficulties of the English language. Now, on any given day, what we call evergreen words, words that have nothing to do with the news, look like this. These are among the top most looked up words in the dictionary. Words like integrity and paradigm, and ubiquitous and insidious. Notice that most of these words are pretty abstract words. Notice that they all have classical roots, Greek and Latin roots. And these are the kinds of words that we see day in and day out, year in and year out, that show that the dictionary has the sort of workhorse words that people turn to. But it has to be said too that a word like integrity as an abstract word is a very difficult word to define. It's not a concrete noun like the noun table or horse or chair. This is an idea, and it's hard to describe those ideas. And I find very frequently that ideas, definitions for ideas are things that we turn to in order to, make our own thoughts more concrete and express them better. So in our writing, often, for example, people will look up words just simply to spark our thoughts. And I think that is part of why people look these words up. Now, it's not just because of vocabulary or current events, but also the calendar. People look up words according to the date. And we see in the early part of February every single year that the word love, and especially the first 2 weeks of the year, is the top #1 word that is looked up in the dictionary. And in this case, I don't think it's for spelling. And it turns out that a word like love is one that people look up for many different reasons, and I think they're more philosophical or encyclopedic reasons. We do have a clue about why people look words up in the dictionary. Part of this clue comes from a letter that was written to the dictionary. We get lots of letters, needless to say. We used to get them entirely on paper, and now we get a huge amount of mail via email, of course. And here's a response to one of those letters from our offices. We thank you for your letter, but your question about how long love lasts is not something we can answer. We lexicographers are good at defining words. Questions about the nature and permanence of deeply felt human emotions, though, are a little outside our field. We're sorry not to be more helpful. Now, it is funny, but it's also quite an earnest and serious letter. But this gives us a clue about what the person was asking about. In other words, this gives us something to mention, and an important distinction that we draw in-house that maybe you've never thought about. A very thin line between what a word means and what its phenomenon is. In other words, we can define the word love, but we can't tell you what it feels like. We can't tell you what you feel. We can't tell you how you feel it, because those are the experiences that only you know. So we are defining the lexical elements of this word. How is it used in context? What part of speech is it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? What is the company it keeps? Is it offensive? Is it archaic? Those are the kinds of things that we can tell from a textual analysis of where this word is found in the language. But we are not defining the phenomenon. We are defining we are basically defining the word as a label for a phenomenon. And so it's important to keep this abstraction, this very thin philosophical line between the label of an idea or an emotion like love and the word itself. So we are involved with the description of the word itself, and we're not involved with the description of the phenomenon. I think that can be maybe a hard thing to understand, but I think it's a very important point when using dictionaries, that we are not telling you what to feel or think, but we are telling you simply what the label of those thoughts usually is used to mean. Now, we also see other kinds of patterns. We see late at night, for example, and on the afternoons of holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, 2-letter words spike in the dictionary, like this word chi and the word za, Z-A, meaning pizza. And this tells us quite simply that all across America, in bar rooms and bedrooms, that Scrabble is being played. And we know that people are playing Scrabble on the afternoon of Thanksgiving, for example, because we see 2-letter words spiking to the very top of the list. We see words that are slightly different in their use from our app and from the cell phone use. Cell phones, of course, put a dictionary in everyone's pocket, and that helps us enormously. And I love having a dictionary in my pocket on a cell phone. You can use it either on your web browser on the phone or through an app. Now, the lookups that we see online are also what drive our word of the year. And the data that goes into that is something that we evaluate toward the end of every year. But 2020, needless to say, was unlike any year. And there were several things that were different and unusual about 2020 that were reflected in the dictionary. Now, the year began with a political story. As you see, January 13th, it was all about impeachment in 2021. But then very shortly afterward, in March, we saw something quite extraordinary. In fact, it's the only time I've ever seen seen our list of words at the top 50 or more words, and every single one of them related to the news of the day, the current news. And we tweeted some of these words on March 13th. And what's interesting to me is to look at these words, and you can break them down into several different categories, because there are medical terms like pandemic and epidemic, and vector and mitigate and virus. But then there are sort of policy terms here, right? There are policy terms like martial law, quarantine, self-isolation. And then there's sort of more cultural terms, the more personal terms like Kafkaesque and apocalypse and lockdown. And then what's sort of poignant to me is we also see words like postpone and cancel. And here I think the word cancel, I remember at that time, I'm sure we all do, that so many events were canceled. And it's interesting to think that we had such an urgent necessity to know these terms and to be familiar with these terms like coronavirus that had existed and had been in the dictionary, but suddenly had this kind of urgent specificity. But the word cancel, I think, shows something else, which is so many people were making signs for their businesses or making postings for Facebook or Twitter. And there's a very basic question that we need to ask, which is, are there one L or two in the word canceled? And it's interesting also to think that American English usually spells canceled with one L because of Noah Webster himself. Webster, who established so many of the standards of American spelling, things that we recognize as American English, as opposed to British English. So the things that we all know, like, the U in words like color and honor and humor, the letter Z in words like analyze and civilization, spellings of the word plow, for example, P-L-O-W. But also Webster hated double letters and he hated silent letters. And so it's because of Webster that the inflections of verbs like cancel and label are typically spelled in American English with a single L, whereas in British English, those inflections are typically spelled with two L's. So what's interesting to me about this is the sort of raw utility of the dictionary. A very poignant, urgent medical specificity on the one hand, and the very sort of earthy and basic knowledge of how to spell a word like canceled. Now, after the initial shutdown and lockdown, there was an unscheduled update, because we update our dictionary online maybe 3 or 4 times a year with new words. This is different from the old model, because we used to wait for a printing of the dictionary, a new printing, and they were often every year. And so there would be one single update possible every year, set in type. Now, in this case, we were able, because of the urgent specificity of this moment, we were able to update the dictionary much more quickly because we could update it online only. What we see here is a printing plate, the copper plate on the left, from Webster's second, the big dictionary from 1934. And we happen to have this particular plate for this particular page on the editorial floor. And I love it. The plate itself, it weighs about as much as a dictionary. It's hard to imagine 3,000 pages worth of those heavy copper plates. But that just simply shows you the old way of updating a dictionary took time to retypeset a page. And now, of course, we could update words online much more quickly. So terms like COVID-19, which was obviously a brand new term, was added to the dictionary, and new information added to definitions like coronavirus and contact tracing and super spreader. Super spreader, which had formerly referred to an individual who spread the disease, like a typhoid Mary, as opposed to an event at which the disease was spread among many people. And so we added a new sense for that term. Social distancing was a new term as well, self-quarantine. So we had these new terms and new elements to dictionary definitions that we could add quickly. And in point of fact, COVID-19, the term itself, from its coinage by the World Health Organization to its entry into Merriam-Webster's dictionary was only 34 days, by far the fastest entry of any term in the history of the company, and probably in all of dictionary publishing, because dictionary publishing was always a slow business. But in this case, of course, this was, again, that urgent specificity. People needed to know. We could see in our data, people were looking this word up and not getting an answer. And so our dictionary staff, our biological and physical sciences staff, our science editors were working on this entry even before the lockdown, because this is what they do. They observe the language as it moves. And because of their good research, we were able to add the dictionary, this word to the dictionary. And the moment it was added, because people were looking this word up by the second, the moment it was added, it spiked. It was a totally unique experience in our data to see this word enter the dictionary at that moment. And just for context, the record holder before COVID-19 was another word that is easy to understand, was added to the dictionary very quickly. The record before was 2 years before its publication, and that word was AIDS. Now, just for us word nerds, it's interesting to talk about some of the etymologies. I recently talked to the spellers at the National Spelling Bee, and I always add elements like this to talk about etymologies, because no one pays more attention to etymologies than the spellers at the National Spelling Bee. But it's interesting to think of this idea of isolation and being isolated. Etymologically, isolation is or being isolated is like saying islanded, because etymologically they're the same word. The word insula in Latin means island, and so it's interesting to me. And if you know a Romance language like French, you know that the word insulation comes from the same word as well. So insulation and isolation are actually the same word in French. And the word island is a cousin. It derives from them as well. And it's interesting too to think about this other related term, quarantine. This is a funny story in English, but it shows how many words in English evolved from Latin roots. And in this case, from the 15th century, there was this Italian term, quarantena, meaning a period of isolation in port. And this derived from earlier plagues where ships were kept for 40 days in port, and no one was allowed into the port city in order to ensure that there was no disease on board. And this word had existed in Italian, but English already had the word quarantine meaning about 40, and this comes from the biblical sense of 40 days and 40 nights, right? So a period of 40 days in English was referred to as a quarantine. And it evolved and became quarantine. So we already have the etymological cousin, the French root. And of course, as you probably know, many words that came from Latin into English came through the French language, largely because of the Norman conquest. Far fewer of them came directly from Italian, but many during this period, many during the Renaissance certainly did come from Italian. And this is a case of the Italian word merging into English, but because English had such a similar word that was spelled in the French manner, that the words merged, and that the meaning from the Italian word merged with the spelling from the French word to become our contemporary word, quarantine. And what's interesting about this is that there's a pattern here in French, and if any of you know French, you know this pattern. That ending, the A-I-N-E ending. In French, you say quarantaine to mean quarantine. And in this case, what you see is a word that meant about 40. And about 40, quarantine. And in French, this pattern, you could say about 50, cinquantaine, or about 100, centaine, about 10. Dizaine. And in English, we didn't. It's interesting because English usually imports useful affixes, and in this case, we only imported it in one instance, and that is the word dozen, which comes from the same root. Now, the word of the year is based on our data, and so the word pandemic, of course, was the obvious choice, and it comes from the word pan, meaning all. And the word demos, of course, meaning people. It's the root of the word democracy and democratic as well. And so we have these words like pandemic, all of the people, epidemic, upon the people, endemic, among the people. Now, for this past year, not just 2020, 2020, but 2021 began with more political news. And needless to say, vaccine was the word of the year last year. And in this case, it's interesting because vaccine was a word that was not just a medical emergency, but it was also a political emergency. And so this word really had two large spikes throughout the year. One was for the medical story, and one was for the political or policy story for mandates. Now, people go to the dictionary for all kinds of things, including word games. And more recently, we've seen that the five-letter words from Wordle also trigger lots of lookups in the dictionary. We make a wordometer every month at the end of the month to explain some of the most looked up terms. Now, people say if you look up a word in the dictionary, that means that you are ignorant, that you don't know that word. And I would say that curiosity is the opposite of ignorance, and that the people I know, writers and editors, often look up words. And I bet if you think about your own dictionary behavior, most of the words that you look up in the dictionary are words that you have encountered before, not words that are brand new to the dictionary. So it's something to think about in terms of the way we use our dictionaries. And that takes us to the end of our story about how we use the dictionary. What we have learned by having the dictionary online is that we now have a very nuanced and detailed and important story about what makes a person look up a word.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you were pleased when you saw the definition of surreal, that it was a good one. What makes a good dictionary definition in your mind?
Right, that's a very important point. Well, first of all, the context is bad definitions. A good one is not a bad one, first of all. And what I mean by bad is because the entire history of lexicography was shoehorning as much information as we could into a printed book, that led to some policies that truncated definitions. So just to make one up, but you'll all recognize this, I made one up in this talk, of or relating to surrealism. That doesn't answer your question. It's not satisfying. However, on a printed page, you could easily find the related term, you know, and so we don't like using words within the definition. So that's kind of a bad definition. But that kind of, you know, if you were looking up the word sesquipedalian and the definition said one afflicted with sesquipedalia, that's not very satisfying. So we want to expand, and so it's going to take the rest of my life, I'm sure, to untie that knot. That the old print standard for definitions were often unsatisfying as definitions. So that's the premise. The second part is to have an elegant and simple and efficient wording. And now online we have more space, so it doesn't mean that radical truncation that dictionary definitions used to have. So we have more room to restate things, and you'll often see those the colon, as we did in that definition, that restates things more than once, sometimes 3 times, so that we put it in different words. The idea is that someone can come to that definition and understand the idea without having to look up another word after it. So I look for, and I find that particular definition had a kind of sort of eloquent efficiency. And that to me is a very high standard. There are lots of definitions in our dictionaries that go on forever, but more often what you find is a definition that is too short to be satisfying, and it sends you off to look up that other term that was used within this one. And we're trying to make definitions now that stand on their own, that stand as a tiny little essay on the meaning of this word.
Interesting. And it leads to a question from the audience who says, even in the short time we've had the Merriam-Webster dictionary change, you know, words change meaning. I'd love to know more about the process of updating the definition of words, not necessarily new words, but old words that might have been defined in the last couple of centuries.
Oh, well, I mean, to me, that is the job, right? The job is revision. People don't recognize, I mean, I always say that, language changes just fast enough that we notice, right? It changes. We do notice the changes, but here's the corollary: we almost always hate the changes that we notice, right? And we want language to be permanent. This is what I call the dictionary paradox, which is that the dictionary, for most people, think about Supreme Court decisions based on definitions. Think about schools banning books because of the way words are used. So this is an important part of our culture, but people expect the dictionary to represent permanence, right? The dictionary has to represent a kind of permanence, and that permanence may be a permanence that is very hard won by each and every one of us, the permanence of our own education and habits of language. We want to see confirmed that that imply doesn't mean infer, for example, and yet another important function of the dictionary, as we just saw, is to add words like COVID-19 to the dictionary. In other words, the dictionary paradox is that the dictionary has to appear to be permanent and to support your ideas of permanence about language, and also be completely flexible and add the novelties, the new parts of the language. So the simple matter is English is a living language, and it is shocking to me to see how frequently words change. The word mean, meaning unfriendly or unkind, is as in mean girls. That's a relatively recent way of using that word. If you look at dictionaries of English before World War II, mean typically meant stingy. And it typically did not mean unkind. Another great example is the word wonderful, which I use every day to mean excellent. But if you look up that word before World War II, that word was almost exclusively used to mean full of wonder or astonishing. And so, for example, a title of the word like, and so what you see is in the King James Bible, a sentence like, God, thy plagues are wonderful. And in that context, you see, okay, this clearly doesn't mean excellent, it means something else. But also something as sort of common and banal as The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the title of a book written in the late 1800s that I think, and this is a case where English often serves as a kind of palimpsest to itself, that you and I might understand that term to mean the excellent Wizard of Oz, right? The most excellent Wizard of Oz, and yet the author meant something very different. The awe-inspiring, the awesome, the astonishing or surprising Wizard of Oz. And so what we have in that palimpsest is the blending, because the word is so familiar to us, but with a slightly different meaning, we no longer actually understand the title of that book in the way it was intended. And that shows you the slippage of meaning, right? That the language slips constantly. And to me, the most interesting ones are the ones that happen so subtly that we don't notice them, like those two words.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many programs we do for Planet Word that can basically boil down to English is changing all the time. And you can like it or not like it, but you might as well like it because it's going to keep happening.
Yeah.
We have somebody ask about data of the most looked up word after January 6th.
Yes, I don't remember just offhand. I think, but I mean, clearly the word insurrection, but the other word was sedition, and both of those words have that important quality. Words that seem to have a specific legal meaning or specific medical meaning are the words that people look up, because English has a class system built into it, don't we? Because we have the sort of old English terms that people used to call Anglo-Saxon terms that are usually the household words or the more emotional words. But then when you get to that Latin vocabulary, the legal vocabulary, any word in English that ends in T-I-O-N is a Latin word, right? So words like surrection or any word that ends in I-O-N. So insurrection and sedition, those are they announce themselves as Latin words, as abstract words, as legal words, as technical words. Those are the words that people go to the dictionary for. So they tend not to go for the dictionary for a word like smash or riot, but to go for the more technical legal words, the words that you would hear in a courtroom. And those are the words that are looked up the most in those moments. And that was a shocking moment. And there were, that was another moment where in moments of shock, what's interesting to me is people turn to the dictionary, and I almost read it as a measure of comfort, a comfort in the permanence of language, that words still mean something. And in this age of fake news and alternative facts and a questioning of expertise everywhere, the dictionary serves as a neutral and objective arbiter of facts about language. And in that sense, it is apolitical. It's also, in a sense, outside of history. And I think that that role of the permanence of the dictionary is an important one that is always served, but never more than today. When now we all on social media, in a sense, social media is great because it gives everyone a voice, but it's also terrible because it gives everyone a voice. So we have to we have to check the
And
fact.
the Merriam-Webster Twitter is very voicey, I mean, I think that's an interesting, it's delightful, but I think that's an interesting choice given that the dictionary itself strives to be so neutral.
Right,
Um,
that's right, but it's important to point out that we only comment on language. That we're not commenting on politics. And the simple fact that, for example, a word is in the news because of politics, and we're getting the data spike in our data, again, implicitly, we're being asked a question. And so I feel like if the country is asking us a question, if they're checking up the word fact, then we can comment on the word fact. And yes, of course, there's a lot of humor I mean, a lot of that kind of tweet comes from, for example, prominent people misspelling in public. And this is a funny thing about English. Spelling is one of those things. It's maybe the last socially acceptable prejudice that we have. In other words, we can see someone misspell, a prominent person misspell a word, and then right away that person will be attacked and say, "Oh, you must be stupid. I can't respect your opinion because you didn't put an apostrophe in your," for example. And we are unbelievably cruel as English speakers to others, because basically, if you're talking about words like there and your, as important as they are to clear edited prose, no one misunderstands the communication. Even if they're slightly misspelled, or think of how devilish words like principle and capital are with their multiple spellings. However, we do use spelling as a shorthand for clarity of thought and consistency of thought, and so it's important to keep that in mind. That spelling might be kind of arbitrary in English, but it marks an enormous amount to readers, doesn't it?
yeah, and people really do enjoy being smug about corrections. We have a question from someone who hosts a podcast inspired by the New York Times Spelling Bee, which is one of the word games that the New York Times puts out daily. I'm a regular player. And Merriam-Webster is their go-to resource. Last week, we had a specific question come up in conversation. How does Merriam-Webster determine when a shortened form of a word is no longer an abbreviation, but a word in its own right? For instance, neocon is listed as a noun, but econ is listed as an abbreviation.
And is that econ like economics? Is that yeah? And so basically, that's a very good question, and the answer is quite simple. When the abbreviation is lexicalized, that is to say, when you start making it a plural, when you start using it as a verb, for example, that's when it becomes a word. That's when it's no longer just an abbreviation, but if you start using it as a noun, that is, and we can tell because it's being made plural, or it's the root of, it's governing verbs. So what we do is, as soon as an abbreviation is governing verbs and made plural, and that kind of thing, then we recognize this is now lexicalized. It is made a word, and the speakers of the language have changed, and adapted and turned this abbreviation into a word, and now it's defined that way.
Somebody asks about removing words from the dictionary. How does that happen?
Yeah, it does happen. I mean, not really so much online. The beauty of the online dictionary is that the challenge of all dictionary publishing for 400 years was lack of space, and now we have plenty of space. So that's one of the big things. So because of lack of space, the big huge purges of words in Webster's third, the famous edition from 1961 of the unabridged dictionary, most of the words that were purged were what we would call obsolete words, or words that were so infrequently encountered or archaic that they simply they didn't merit entry anymore. So mostly they were just obsolete terms. In the more current dictionaries, there are a few funny stories. Most of the words that are dropped in the collegiate dictionary, again, because of print size, had been terms that were compound terms. So for example, plantsman, meaning a gardener, was dropped. And my favorite, crossbowman, one who wields a crossbow. Now, in both cases, I think the editors decided, first of all, we need a couple of those lines in the dictionary. And second of all, those were kind of self-evident. You could figure out what crossbowman means, and certainly in context, it would be very clear. A couple of a little bit more colorful words that we maybe wouldn't drop today. One I remember from the 10th collegiate was tattletale gray. tattletale gray was like ring around the collar. It was a marketing kind of device used in the 1960s and 70s for, I think, laundry detergent or something. And it was so frequently used that it was sometimes, I think, lexicalized, used about things that weren't shirts. In other words, that things were getting unpleasant or too worn as ideas. And so it was added to the dictionary and then kind of quietly taken out. But one that was taken out, that was put back in, was a word that was used by Bill O'Reilly, because he would often use these fancy words, and he would use words like sesquipedalian, and I always forget the stupid word. It begins with an S also, but it was a word that meant an unpleasant, unprincipled person. And it had been dropped from the dictionary, and then we put it back in because we got so many hits on, people were looking it up all the time. And I'm just blanking on the word itself. It'll come to me. That's the problem with you're always thinking of examples. The examples
right. It's going to come to you as soon as we end the webinar, because we're almost out of time. But
I know. Yes.
I wanted to follow up on one final question, which is, are people still buying physical dictionaries?
Oh, absolutely. Print dictionaries are still a really good business. If you were a publisher, you'd be envious of the hardcover sales. We sell an enormous number of books. They're not the same numbers that they were before the internet, but we are now a hybrid business. We have the dictionary online, we have the apps, but we have the best-selling hardcover book in American history, the Collegiate Dictionary, our usage dictionary, the bilinguals, the French, the Spanish, all the dictionaries for children, the visual dictionaries, it goes, the legal dictionary, the medical dictionary, and in particular in places like Latin America, for example, our print sales are very strong. So the business is still very much a print business as well as an online business.
Well, Peter Sokolowski, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
It's a treat. Thank you for everything. And I can't wait to get back to Planet Word.
Oh, someone put in snollygoster. Is that the word?
That's the word. That's it.
That's
Thank you.
the word. Well done, chat. I knew our people.
That's the word. Thank you so much. And if you look it up, by the way, it will say, I bet I got the definition almost word for word, because it's one of those things that you remember the definition, but not the heading.
Well, thank you, audience, for joining us, and thank you for coming through with that missing word, and we will see you next time. Good night.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.